Coming up on Dr. Kiki Science Hour, viruses, bacteria, parasites, and science tattoos. Science writer Carl Zimmer joins us. Coming up.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Dr. Kiki's Science Hour is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Dr. Kiki's Science Hour, recorded March 31st, 2011, episode 89, Bacteria, Viruses, and Parasites, oh my. Welcome to Dr. Kiki's Science Hour. I am not Dr. Kiki. Dr. Kiki is still away on maternity leave. I believe her beautiful baby boy is now 27 days old as the nano-tracking continues. I'm Brian Malow, sciencecomedian.com. That would be my verbal lower third, I guess. And I think we're going to have a great time today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation with a science writer, Carl Zimmer, who has written about, now he's up to about 9 books, I think we just determined, and on quite a variety of topics. He's most interested, it seems, in biology and evolution. He's written books on bacteria, E. coli in particular. He's written on parasites and evolution, and his latest book is about viruses. It's a planet of viruses, and it's due out May 1st from University of Chicago Press. Say hello to my guest, Carl Zimmer. Carl, you there?
Hey, Brian.
I knew you were there. That was that was sort of disingenuous because we've already been here, as they all know.
Brian, I'm so surprised you called.
Wow, what a coincidence. Maybe we should chat for a while. So,
let's do it.
Carl is an incredibly prolific writer. I'm very envious of, I don't know how you do it. He has a very popular blog called The Loom that's at Discover Magazine, and he also writes for the New York Times and Slate and other places, in addition to these full-length books. I'm currently reading one of them. It's even open in front of me. It's Microcosm, and it's subtitled E. coli and the New Science of Life. And so we'll be talking about that. It's a very enjoyable read. But Carl, let us begin with the subject you've been spending the most time with lately, and the subject of your newest book, Planet of Viruses. How did this even come about? What made you decide to write a book about viruses?
Well, I don't know. Maybe E. coli was just getting too big for me or something, so I had to get even smaller. Actually, it was part of an education project that I got involved in, based at the University of Nebraska. It's this NIH-funded project. And I was working on these essays. I would pick out a virus I was interested in, and I would write an essay about it. And then I'd write another one and another one. And after a while, the people I was working with said, "I think you just wrote a book." And I said, "Oh, maybe you're right." So I put all these together, and we got in contact with the University of Chicago Press, and they were like, "Yeah, this is a book, actually." So then after that, I did a lot of retooling and actually making it into a true book. Yeah, and now it just showed up in my house just minutes ago. So there it is.
Excellent. Yes.
Yeah,
so,
very psyched.
That distinction you just made. So what would you? I think that throughout this, that since we met at a conference called the Science Online Conference in January that's all about science communication, I think it would be nice to weave that subject in and out of this. But what would you even say is, what kind of distinction between what would make it a science book as opposed to what, just a long essay or a magazine article?
Yeah, I'm having a harder time figuring that out these days. For my blog, I know I'm supposed to write like 2-sentence blog posts, but I gave a talk in San Francisco about sort of our inner ecology and, these 100 trillion microbes that we share our body with. And I found myself turning it into a piece of writing, and it ended up being 5,000 words long, and it's not the sort of thing that you would put in a newspaper. It's too short for a book. So I put it on my blog, but it's outrageously long for a blog post, but who cares, I guess. I mean,
Right.
you just stick it on Instapaper, it's all the same. So just read it and enjoy, I guess. So yeah, it's it's interesting. I'm just old enough that, I was brought up in journalism when these barriers were very clear cut. A book was a book, and a magazine article was a magazine article, and
And there was
all the
no
rest.
such thing as a blog.
Oh yeah, nothing. No, I mean, I literally was, I'm dating myself, but I mean, I went up to my editor at Discover Magazine and I said, there's this thing called email, and we should get it. And no one had heard of the web back then, and so yeah, it was long ago, and it's almost inconceivable now. So
Yeah.
I mean, this is still a book, I think, because I think the main reason I know that I've written a book is because I can go like this.
Yeah.
It makes a nice sound.
You can heave it. It has some mass to it. Well, viruses are pretty fascinating. And I guess, let me do this, and I promise I won't subject people to this much, but I have a very short video clip where I just barely touch on this subject, and maybe you can help me address a question that I bring up at the very beginning of this short clip. This is my take on viruses from a science festival.
The ultimate David and Goliath. We must have a height advantage and a mass advantage of trillions on a virus, and yet it can take you down. It can kill you. It's like Luke Skywalker taking out the Death Star in a little X-wing fighter. And I mean, viruses are pretty amazing. I bet most of you have this level of understanding, at least, that they go into a cell. It's barely a life form on its own, but when it goes into a cell, it completely takes over the machinery and turns it to its own uses. It's a hostile takeover, your cells under new management. And I mean, it really, truly, it's bizarre. Like, it would be like going into a Coke factory and having them make Pepsi. Or weirder, like going into a Nike factory and having them crank out Twinkies. And if you think about this kind of stuff too hard, here's the kind of jokes you come up with. A virus walks into a bar. The bartender says, we don't serve viruses in this bar. The virus replaces the bartender and says, now we do. An infectious disease walks into a bar. The bartender says, we don't serve infectious diseases in this bar. The infectious disease says, well, you're not a very good host. That's okay, groaning is acceptable. The joke is sound. Two bacteria walk into a bar. The bartender says, we don't serve bacteria in this bar. The bacteria say, but we work here. We're staff.
All right. So, Carl, I hate to subject you to that because I know you've already heard those. But now, the question...
The staff one, man. The staff joke.
I know.
You had to go for the staff.
I had to. I'm not above puns. So, one of the questions that I touched there, I wonder if you addressed this in Planet of Viruses, but is a virus even a life form on its own?
The absolute scientific answer is sort of.
Now, don't get too technical with us there.
Well, I'm telling you, you look in the Journal of Virology, there it is, sort of. I mean, you got to give me a definition of life so that I can know if it fits it or not. And, if you can do that, then, you have just done what centuries worth of philosophers have tried and failed to do. It's very hard to say what it really means to be alive in the first place. And you can say, well, I'll tell you what it is. It's everything that I do. It's something that metabolizes and can have kids and whatever. But then I'll say, well, okay, does that mean it wears glasses and has hair like you? And you'd say, well, no. I'm just talking about the essence of life. But no one's had a really great idea about the essence of life is. So let me put it this way. So viruses can't do some of the things that we can do, so they can't host an online science show, that's for sure. And they can't, they can't, go out and eat a plant. They can't do that. That's true. And they can't really metabolize, or at least most of them can't. But, then you get some really weird viruses that seem to have genes. The only thing that we know that they do is they're involved in metabolism. So there might be some genes that do at least a little metabolism. So it's really blurry. So they're part of life. Let me put it that way.
Right.
How's that for a punt?
That's yeah. Okay. So, well, let's say, what do we know? What's maybe one of the most surprising things that you learned about viruses in the course of writing this book? How about that?
Oh, well, okay. There are tons of interesting things about viruses, but sort of the craziest one is that it has to do with the title of the book. I call it A Planet of Viruses. And what I'm trying to say here is that viruses are the most abundant life form on Earth. Let's call them a life form for now. They're the most abundant of anything, and they're also incredibly important on a kind of a global scale, like in terms of, controlling the climate and things like that. I'm not exaggerating. So here's one of those kind of planetary scale crazy facts about viruses. So if you took every virus on Earth and you stacked them end to end, I'll leave that to you to figure out how to do it. That stack would extend 100 million light years.
Is that possible? Light years?
Yeah,
That's
I keep
insane.
asking. I know,
Yeah,
it is insane. I keep asking virologists. Every time they tell me that, I'm like, do I have this right?
Wow.
Do I have this right? I mean, even if it was like 1 million light years, I'd be pretty amazed. But if it's 100 million. So I think that's my favorite one, just because it just shows you just how many of those viruses are seething around on our planet.
Yeah. I think you said something about how that viruses may have helped give rise to the first life forms. I know that this issue of how life began is still pretty mysterious, but what does that mean? What do we know about viruses' role in early life?
Well, it's not like there are any virus fossils floating around. There aren't any virus fossils, period, that I'm aware of, and there certainly aren't any from like 3 billion years ago. So you have to kind of take a look at the evidence we can look at and kind of infer your way back. So one thing you can do is you can look at the tree of life. So how are things related to each other? And these days, what scientists do is they compare sequences of DNA from different species and figure out who's related to who and how old different lineages are. So, our DNA is very close to chimpanzees because we share a close ancestor about 6 million years ago. It's a lot less similar to, a palm tree because we probably diverged about, I think about 2 billion years ago. So when you look at virus DNA, some of it looks a lot like the DNA of certain host species, so maybe viruses kind of spin off of free-living animals or bacteria or what have you and become viruses. So they're kind of young. But then you get these genes in viruses that are just, if you sort of trace down their branch to where it meets the rest of the tree of life, they go down really far. I mean, it looks like they go down as far as to the common ancestor of all living things. So there were viruses probably around since the very beginning. And then some people have some pretty wild theories that are actually, seem to explain a lot of the evidence pretty well, that maybe these primordial viruses were the first things that invented or evolved DNA. So before that, there was some simpler kind of genetic material. And so maybe viruses evolved DNA as sort of a protection for their genes. So when they invaded a host, the host couldn't chop up their DNA and kill them. And then maybe eventually the host said, hey, this DNA is pretty cool. I'm going to take that and make it my genes. And now we live in a DNA-dominated world. That's the idea.
Yeah, and then so we know now, as far down the line as we are, this much more recent development in evolution, we do know that a lot of the DNA in the human genome is directly traceable to viruses. I think that's another thing. Is it actually more DNA from viruses than what we consider our own genes?
Yeah. Then it's a pretty freaky concept, but and it's hard to believe. But so here's the thing. So we have genes, sort of our genes, and there are about 20,000 of the ones that encode proteins. And that only makes up about 1.2 or so % of the genome. And now, then you've got these viruses, and what happens is that certain kind of viruses, when they infect the cell, they inject their DNA into their host cell. So that's kind of how they make a living. So they inject it in, and then the cell starts using that information to make new viruses. That's like what HIV does. And now, eventually, that cell that's infected with HIV just dies, and zillions of HIVs pour out and go infect other cells. Every now and then, though, these viruses get into a sex cell, maybe an egg, for example, and they put their DNA in the genome, and then it gets stuck there. And actually, when that egg becomes fertilized and gives rise to a baby, that baby is carrying in every one of its cells that virus DNA.
Is this DNA that's expressed, that's making proteins, that's a part of who we are in that sense?
Well, yes and no. So what it looks like happens is that initially, and by initially I mean maybe, I don't know, hundreds, thousands of years, this is a virus that can actually break out of its host every now and then. So actually, believe it or not, this is a problem for koala bears right now. They got infected with a virus that it can sort of integrate itself into the host genome and get passed down from one generation to the next, but it can still break out and then go infect other koalas. And it's actually, when it infects them, it makes them quite sick, and it's a big problem. Now, over enough time, that DNA in that virus mutates, and so it loses the ability to break out, and it becomes trapped. And after a while, at best what it can do, it's sort of in this feeble state where it can make a copy of itself, but can only insert it back in the same genome. It can't actually leave its host cell anymore. So it's kind of, semi-retired. And then eventually they get so mutated they can't do anything, and they just sit there. So
it's just like abandoned, lost DNA that's taking up space in the human genome?
Right. And so the last I saw, something like 8% or 10% of the human genome is from this old virus DNA. And some of it came into our ancestors like 30 million years ago, but you can still recognize it as being viruses, viruses that are related to HIV, or viruses related to weird other viruses like Bornavirus and stuff like that. And it's still there. And what's particularly cool is that every now and then, evolution has sort of grabbed a tiny piece of this junk and sort of fashioned it into something useful. So when human babies are in the womb, they make a placenta which fuses to the mother's body, to her uterus, and there are these little channels that connect them. And that's where a lot of these nutrients come through. Those connections, that kind of the glue, as it were, it keeps a baby connected to its mother. That protein's from a virus. And all mammals have it. All placental mammals have it. So we could, if it wasn't for that, If it wasn't for that virus, I don't know, maybe we would, be growing up in our mother's pouch or
Right.
hatching from an egg.
Right. Well, so I suspect, let me see if I know you well enough. Did you, in the course of this, in the course of your research for this, did you come to have a favorite virus? I suspect you do.
Oh, but you see, viruses are like children,
There's two. It's so hard to pick one, huh?
You love them all.
Well,
Yeah.
start with telling me this. What is
Well,
this one? Like there's some that have some pretty crazy effects and some horrific effects, I guess. What is this one that makes strange growths come out of humans?
Oh. So that's papillomavirus, right?
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. So papillomavirus is, people probably, if they've ever heard of it, know it for cervical cancer. But lots of people have papillomavirus. It causes warts. And it sometimes is just sitting on your skin and it's not causing any trouble at all. And lots of mammals have it too. And so it's one of these incredibly common viruses just floating around everywhere. And it does a lot of different things. And actually the first time that people noticed the papillomavirus was, it actually had to do with this legend. So have you ever heard of a jackalope?
Yes, that's the mythological, or not mythological, but mythical, say, the jackalope, part jackrabbit, part antelope.
Right. So I remember the first time I saw a jackalope, I was riding my bike across country and I stopped with my friends in a diner in Wyoming and they had this big collection of postcards for sale of jackalopes and they had a jackalope on a wall, if I remember. Yeah, so you're looking
I
at
noticed most sightings of jackalopes are on postcards or perhaps on walls, mounted on walls. That might be approaching 100% of the sightings.
But it's evidence, right?
Yes.
So so the things that you see in these diners are basically rabbits, probably with, I assume it's pronghorn antelope horns stuck on them, or I don't know, clay or something, But basically, it's all fake. Except it's not totally fake. The fact is that people would see rabbits with growths on their head and that kind of looked like horns. And they're like, what is this? And so actually a scientist back east, he had a friend who hunted in I believe, Wyoming, just kill a couple of these rabbits and ship them back to him. And he would grind up those horns and see if there was something interesting in it. I mean, this is pretty early on. This was about, I think, 80 years ago now, in the 30s, if I remember. And so basically, he had some pretty crude scientific equipment, just let's grind stuff up. And but he ground up these jackalope horns and then would inject them into other rabbits, and lo and behold, they would grow these horns or.
So some of the virus is actually up there in that horn as well, or its DNA.
Yeah. And so when it gets in people, usually it doesn't cause that much harm. But so if it gets there are some forms, if they get into a woman's cervix, then they can cause cancer, and it's really a serious problem.
Yeah.
As
opposed to the minor problem of just having horns. Right?
Yeah, well, actually, so their people sometimes have this problem. I don't know if you ever heard about this guy who went by the name of Tree Man. The Tree Man?
Sounds familiar.
A couple years ago, there was a man, or actually a teenage boy in Indonesia who was being taken around basically as a freak show.
Yeah.
And his hands had grown into what looked like gigantic tree branches. And it was just totally surreal. And he had human papillomavirus. The problem was that his immune system couldn't keep it in check. And so it would just basically what was happening was that the virus was taking over his cells, and instead of just killing them, he was having the virus was having the cells grow fast, and they grew so fast that they produced these growths that would just take off. And so doctors came and when he came into the news, doctors showed up and they cut off a lot of these growths, and then they would just grow right back. So he started needing this constant medical care to keep these viruses in check.
Yeah.
Because they're really odd, because they don't, they're not like a flu virus. You get the flu, I mean, it gets in your airway and it's just out to kill. It's just going to invade cells in your airway and just use them up, blow them up, and spew out lots of flu viruses and move on to the next victim. Papillomavirus does something very different. It says, no, I'm not going to kill you. I'm just going to actually make you grow faster, because if you grow faster, then there are more of me.
Yeah, that's a crazy thing about all these things that infect us, that it's amazing to me that something like a virus that maybe if it's on your hands, it's harmless. If it's on your arm, it's harmless. But it has to get into your eye, and then all of a sudden it does something. That idea that these viruses, that they don't do much until they get into the wrong place. There's things that are bacteria that are on our skin and are harmless, but if they get inside us, they're harmful. There's something kind of amazing.
Yeah. So now in some cases it's just that. So like, if you got skin bacteria and it gets into a wound, say, and into your blood, I mean, that's actually not a great thing for the bacteria itself. But there's nothing. There are things that are keeping it in check on your skin. It's in a certain balance for a lot of different reasons. It gets in your blood, and those breaks are taken off, and it just reproduces like crazy. It makes you sick, but it's not actually particularly good for the bacteria. It's not
where it wants to be.
Right, it gets transmitted from skin contact. So what's it doing in your blood? I mean, how's that going to help it? Whereas with these viruses you're talking about, I mean, they're very adapted to making you sick in one particular part of your body for their own benefit.
In a way that'll help them spread. And like sexually transmitted is what an amazing mechanism.
Yeah.
Right? You're fairly likely to be, to be able to pass on, because the species you're infecting wants to reproduce.
Right. It's a great way to get from one individual to another, because that is like that's a very common form of contact. Now the thing is that you got to be able to live in certain kinds of environments,
For that,
so that takes for a lot of adaptations, shall we say.
I saw you mention somewhere that about AIDS, it seems like, at least in my experience in my lifetime, like we're not hearing about AIDS and HIV as much as we were at one point. But I guess it's is this right? It's evolving in a bunch of different directions. Is it how fearful do we have to be about the HIV virus today?
Well, it's still one of the still a massive scourge if you think about it worldwide. Something like, I think about 60 million people still have it, and those rates are still going up overall. That being said, it's certainly in a lot more control in a lot of places, and there are treatments that people can take now to keep it in check. Although these antiretrovirals virals also have they have some side effects, and so it's not a free lunch, as it were.
Right.
But still, HIV is not a death sentence if you can afford these drugs.
Well, that's a problem. I mean, where it's a problem in Africa, I suppose no one there can afford the drugs.
Right. I mean, if you're making $1 a day and someone says you need to take these $10 a day of drugs, it's like, well, it's going to be a problem. And yes, unfortunately, HIV is constantly evolving. I mean, it's viruses, particularly viruses like HIV are they evolve very quickly because they have a high mutation rate. They're very sloppy when they copy themselves, and so that means that even in a single host, there will be a lot of natural selection going on, and there's some concern that they could become resistant to some of these drugs, and we don't know if that's going to happen or not. And what scares me more is that HIV is actually a few different related viruses that crossed over into our species from chimpanzees, came over from chimpanzees maybe like 3 different times, and also from a monkey as well. And so so there are a lot of other similar viruses in primates, and they may not be making us sick now, but they might in the future.
Just by virtue of if they mutate the wrong way, a future mutation, and suddenly they're a problem for us. Yeah. Yeah.
So, but they have to be getting in. The way it seems that viruses cross over and become dangerous to us is that we're sort of getting regularly exposed to them. And so it seems that the way that people got exposed to HIV was with hunting chimpanzees and hunting monkeys, the bushmeat trade. The people are killing infected animals. Maybe they have a cut themselves, and so there's a lot of they're getting infected. And maybe 100 years ago the viruses weren't very good at infecting people, but over time, with enough evolution, bingo, they started to take advantage of this new host, and then they took off.
Well, let me ask you, let me shift a little. Like, it's interesting to me that you've written entire books now about viruses, about bacteria, in fact, in particular, the one bacteria, E. coli, and another entire book, Parasite Rex, that's just about parasites. So all of these parasites, bacteria, and viruses, although all bacteria and viruses might not be parasites, they are parasitic in a way, or many of them are symbiotic with us, obviously. But what is it, Carl? Like, and what else is left to you now that you've done those? Do you have your sights set on? Is there something else to complete this theme, or what is it with? Were you always into like the morbid and Stephen King and horror and gross stuff, or medical oddities?
I certainly was.
Good.
But I don't think I was alone.
No.
And I do actually write about lots of other things as well. I mean, I wrote a book called Soulmate Flesh, which was about the dawn of neurology in the 1600s, and I put some of my writings about the brain together for an ebook called Brain Cutting. So I can write about humans too, actually. Whether you consider humans a parasite or not, I guess we can discuss. But
I think there's a lot of evidence that we are. Yes.
Yeah. Well, we're just not very good parasites, I think. Yeah. That's the problem. We're clumsy.
At least, if not parasites, maybe a scourge. Would that be from a global point of view? Your E. coli book, Microcosm, is great and beautiful writing in it too. Just in terms, just really wonderful, and the way that your opening scene, you're holding a little petri dish that has some E. coli growing on it, and you're talking about it and the life outside your window, and you actually look through it out at the view through your window, and then you say that you're going to look at life through the lens of E. coli. And sure enough, that's what the book does. The book is not just about E. coli, but E. coli is maybe the the best researched microorganism maybe on the planet, and it's a good model for
actually the best research organism. Period.
Yeah,
not just
microorganism.
I mean, we know a lot more. Right. I think you could argue that we know a lot more about how E. coli works than about how humans work. Just in terms of sort of, if you look at what percentage of the genes in the human genome do we understand versus what percentage of genes in E. coli do we understand? The thing is that with E. coli, people have been studying it for 100 years, and they made it into basically the model organism they would study to understand life itself. So we know E. coli really well, and as you say, that was my goal in the book. I mean, it's not just writing about one weird, gross bacterium, but just saying, hey, actually, believe it or not, this odd little creature has told us a lot about what we know about life in general, including ourselves.
Yeah, and one of the things that makes it great to study, not only does it have a smaller genome, so that now our gene sequencing techniques are very quickly accelerating to the point that that pretty soon it'll be very easy to just sequence an entire genome of an individual. But historically, in recent decades, the fact that E. coli had such a small genome made it easier to analyze on that level, but also because it can go through so many generations so quickly. So there's a guy that you wrote about, and I guess he's back in the news. And I guess he'll continue to make news because he has a very long-running evolutionary study of E. coli.
Yeah. Richard Lensky. He's at Michigan State. So about just over 20 years ago, he took one E. coli essentially and started breeding it. And he took the clones from this E. coli and started 12 different lines in 12 flasks. And each flask would get a little bit of glucose in the morning, and they would feed on it, and then they would run out of food. And then it had to basically survive for a day until the following morning. And then Lensky or one of his students would come along and draw out a little bit of that fluid from that flask and stick it in a new flask with a lot of fresh glucose, and that would grow again and repeat 20 years. And for E. coli, that actually works out to be, I think, 52,000 generations so far. Lensky, I discovered actually on his website at Michigan State University. If you look up Richard Lensky, Michigan State University, you'll get to his website, and he's actually got a counter now
of how many generations?
Sort of odometer. Yeah. So you can see precisely how many generations he's up to. It's hysterical. It's over 52,000.
Well, let me ask you something. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that, I mean, what he wanted, the reason he did this was not just to sit around watching E. coli grow, but because it mutates and it basically adapted to, there it is, 52,572 and almost to 0.5, I guess. Yeah. So anyway, there you go. And rolling. Hourly, I think,
I think it just moved.
Did it?
I don't know. It might have. That little tenths thing may have shifted a little. Because how quickly is a generation? Is it hours?
Well, E. coli can grow in as little as 20 minutes. It can divide every 20 minutes, but that's like when it's going totally berserk. His stuff is probably going, maybe, I forget, maybe like something on the order of once an hour or something like that. It's slow.
He's been able to track changes. He's been able to see new and different behaviors and abilities in different strains of E. coli compared to the older generations.
Yeah, so he can actually he freezes some of the E. coli every 500 generations, and he's got these giant freezers with names like Valhalla, because that's where the heroes go to rest. But then the heroes can be resurrected. He just takes these things out of the freezer, thaws them out, and he can stick the ancestors and their descendants in the same dish and see how fast they grow compared to each other.
Like Thunderdome.
And, I mean, yeah.
2 microorganisms enter, one microorganism leaves.
Right. But I don't know. But it would be more like some sort of I don't know. It'd be like Alien versus Predator, except I don't know. It would be like the Terminator versus Thor or something like that. Because these are E. coli that have been separated by thousands of generations.
Right.
And he can have them side by side and see what they're like side by side.
Now, I don't know if you addressed this in microcosm, because I haven't finished yet. But so he has seen changes that we say are evidence of evolution. But have we seen, how come with so many generations we haven't seen E. coli change into a different species? Have we? And how would we know if it was a different species?
Well, he may have actually. It's a little dicey saying what is and isn't a species, particularly within bacteria, because the definition that people like to use for species is, well, it's these individuals that can breed together,
right?
And E. coli doesn't get it on the way that animals do, so that's out. But in any case, so microbiologists have this list of ways of identifying E. coli. And does it grow on glucose? Yes. Okay. Does it grow in the presence of oxygen? Yes. Good. Now, one of the things that is sort of one of the hallmarks for E. coli is it able to grow on something called citrate? That's what makes lemons kind of tart. Is it able to grow on citrate in the presence of oxygen? And if the answer is yes, then what you've got is not E. coli. You just look at
normal, what we call
books.
E. coli is not able to do that.
Right. So one day, somebody in Lensky's lab basically, walked in to check on the E. coli, and discovered that one of the flasks was very cloudy. In other words, it had really taken off, and it was growing much faster, and it must have found something else to eat, because there isn't much glucose in these flasks. And they figured out that it was starting to eat citrate. And they were able to show that it evolved the ability to eat citrate. And so, if it actually breaks a definition, a species definition, it sounds like it has become a new species to me. But Lensky is very, very cautious. I actually wasn't able to get that into microcosm because
hang on a second. We're getting a little weird. I wonder if it's only when you're talking. We were just getting a really bad audio sound. Say something again.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. It's when you talk. I don't know why, but all of a sudden we've started a kind of noise.
Switch headphones?
Yeah, I'll tell you what. Are you using a mic, or are you just speaking into?
I've got a headset.
Okay. Can you unplug your mic and let us call you back in just a second? Just let's disconnect. Unplug your mic and plug it back in, and we'll call you right back.
Okay.
All right, thanks. Sorry about that. And we'll see if this fixes it. The classic, unplug it. Always the first line of defense, right? Reboot. We don't have time for that. See if we can get him back.
Hello?
Oh, that sounds much better.
Oh, excellent. Okay.
So sorry about that.
No problem. I've done podcasts and we're using Skype, and it's a beautiful thing some days, and some days it just makes you crazy. So.
Yeah. So he's very cautious about what Lensky wants to call this development, but it looks like the development of something much different from the strain of E. coli that he was raising, with a very different kind of ability.
Right. So maybe I would not be surprised if maybe in, say, 3 years, he publishes a paper, say, a paper that names this microbe sitting in one of his flasks as a new species.
Yeah.
And he watched it become a new species. But that's just my prediction based on, what I've read. I mean, he's not going to say anything on the record or even off the record about it until he's dotted all his I's and crossed all his T's, because this is pretty big deal stuff. And it's the sort of stuff that, for example, creationists love to try to beat up on, because they don't like the idea that you can actually study natural selection in our own time. So they prefer to say, well, this isn't natural selection or something like that.
Why do you characterize it just like that? Why do you think they don't like that ability? That was an interesting characterization of their point of view.
Well, because
you mean creationists who don't believe there's any evolution happening? Certainly don't want to believe there's any chance that. But now we've had evidence. Now, if we don't have clear evidence of species evolving into new species, in times that would short times that would surprise Darwin, we've seen populations dramatically change physical features.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Like the beak of the finch, right? Isn't that one of your favorite science writers? When I asked you for a couple favorite science writers, you said,
yeah.
Is that
Jonathan
Weiner wrote The Beak of the Finch?
Yeah, wonderful book. Yeah, people should definitely read it if they haven't.
And in just the course of a couple seasons, the beak size or shape or size of these finches' beaks has changed.
Right, yeah. So these are Darwin's finches that live on the Galapagos Islands, and it's a pretty rough place with a lot of droughts followed by heavy rains, through these kind of El Nino cycles. And, these birds sometimes will find themselves in a year where there's nothing but really tough seeds around, and all the nice soft food is gone. So if you don't have a beak that can handle that, you probably just die. And so you can see the selection for beak size and shape 1 year to the next, and it's just there it is, and it changes direction depending on the sort of food that's around. And so they can actually measure this in a very statistical way, which is something Darwin never imagined. Which is ironic because they're named after Darwin because he first went to the Galapagos and collected them. But he had no idea just how important they would be in this regard. Yeah. But there are lots and lots of other examples. The thing with Rich Lensky's E. coli work is that, you've got everything. I mean, you've got the ancestors, you've got this record and everything has been taking place under his watchful eye. And because E. coli is so small, you can sequence genomes now. I mean, when he started this, there was no way actually that he could, identify genes or anything. This was 20 years ago. Now he's like, okay, which genomes will I sample? I think I'll do 10. Boom, 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 boom. It's just a few $100 a pop. What does he care? So now he just has this unbelievable window into evolution. So I think that's just one of the reasons why he comes under attack a lot from creationists.
Right. So I want to repeat that my guest is Carl Zimmer, and go follow him at Carl Zimmer. Show him the power of the Twit network when it comes to Twitter at Carl Zimmer with a C. And let's talk about parasites a little bit. Because you've got Parasite Rex. Yeah. Great. Yeah, you seem to really like that subject. When I mentioned it, you said, well, now we're talking about your world, the world of parasites. And
that's right.
One of the things that got me thinking, I just saw something, something bacterial, which is that there was a new story about bacteria in our guts having an influence on our minds. And there might be a correlation between the bacterial fauna or flora, I guess, in our guts and the development of our personality. That seems so bizarre and surprising.
That's because you're just not willing to submit
to the true source of the power. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. You're not willing to accept that you are not an individual, but you're actually a superorganism.
We are, aren't we?
You are an ecosystem, thousands of species. And look, and I have to correct you on this. These are not parasites that are doing this.
Right. I was gonna these are our symbiotic bacteria that we depend on in our gut. Right. The thing is,
if I cleaned you out of those,
I'd be in trouble, huh?
You would be very sad, yes.
Yeah, that's amazing how that would even come to be, that in order for us to properly digest our food, that we're dependent on this other organism, how this kind of symbiosis occurs throughout the animal kingdom. But what happened is I read this, it led me to this other story about this fungus that can infect ants and then control the ant on the macro level. And this is not the only example of it, but parasites that get into something and then they keep referring to them as zombies because then the fungus controls the ant.
Right. Yeah. So this is called cordyceps, and actually, there's I forget the name. One of the antibiotics that's used a lot is actually made by cordyceps. So when you go to the doctor and they prescribe you an antibiotic, you might be taking a sort of zombie parasite compound. So it's really. I do remember like the first time I read about this, and it was in this wonderful book. Oh gosh, I'm blanking on it. Unfortunately, it was this wonderful book about this museum, and the reporter can't decide if the museum is all a fake or not.
Right.
He's pretty sure it's all fake, but he can't tell. And the fakest thing he thinks is this fungus. And then he discovers that it's real. And so what's so unbelievable about it is that when an ant gets infected with this fungus, the spore kind of burrows into its skin through its cuticle and goes into its body, and then it starts to feed on the insides and starts to send out these little tendrils just inside its body initially.
But it doesn't kill it.
Importantly, no.
Yes.
That's right. Yeah. You wouldn't want to, you wouldn't want to burn down your restaurant.
Right.
But what does happen is that the ant, after a while, only when the fungus is really ready to move on to the next step, the ant gets this urge to climb up, and it climbs up plants and clamps on to the undersides of their leaves, and it's very specific. So there's this one scientist who found that that they only go the ants only end up on the north by northwest side of these leaves, and only like a couple feet up off the ground, because the fungus is trying to get to the perfect weather conditions, the perfect temperature, the perfect humidity, the perfect amount of sunlight, where it can then grow. And so what happens is it basically fills up the whole body of the ant, and then tendrils start to come out, the fungal tendrils start to come out from the ant and sort of glue it to the leaf, and the ant kind of starts to mummify. Eventually, it dies.
We actually have a picture
finally,
too.
the most yeah. Show the picture.
One of the ant with the thing growth coming out of its head.
Yeah, this is the most spectacular stage, because what happens is that the ant, a giant stalk grows out of the ant's head usually, and there's a big package of spores on top. Yeah, there we go. So that big ball that's sticking off that stalk on that ant on the bottom there, which is a little easier to see, that is oh, thanks, great, yeah. So that's all fungal spores. Now that leaf has actually been turned upside down. So actually, in nature, the ant would be pointing. It would be hanging, pointing down towards the ground. That ant is holding on to dear life to that little vein there, and then the fungus spores. That little package just pops open. And there's another one showing it hanging upside. Yeah, that's how it really looks like, and it's totally surreal.
I mean,
so the fungus spores just start raining down on other ants.
Every aspect of this is incredible. The fact that the fungus inside it can do something to cause the ant to do that specific behavior, climb up a plant to a certain height and then clamp its teeth down. It's hard to wrap your mind around that, how that could exhibit such mind control.
Yeah, to some extent, but I mean, nobody knows how they do it. Let me put it that way. But it, you can start thinking about it by thinking about things like Prozac. There's just a fairly simple molecule. You take it, and you're different. Your personality is different, and so and fungi are great at making chemicals. So, like I said, they make an antibiotic. Actually, they use this antibiotic inside the ant because as the ant is dying off, you get bacteria moving in, and they want to like feed on this yummy dead ant, and the fungus is like, "Whoa, back off! This is mine." So it makes antibiotics that ward off bacteria and basically keep the ant sort of bacteria free. So they have a whole kind of pharmacopoeia in there, and so if they make some psychoactive drugs for the ant, that's fine.
Yeah.
But it is pretty weird that they're able to get an ant to go to point X.
Right.
Go here on this leaf.
Yeah.
Nobody knows how they do that. It is freaky.
I don't know if Alex will recognize this. There's a picture of a fish that's a fish mouth. There's another parasite. Now we're talking larger parasites. So lest someone think that the only parasites you're interested in are microscopic, tell me something about this fish and crustacean relationship.
Yeah, so this is this parasite's called an isopod.
Oh, you don't have it?
So
I don't know if we have. Well, you can describe this anyway. It's there's some open. I thought we had that. But that's okay.
If you go to my website, carlzimmer.com, and if you go to books, then go to Parasite Rex, and then there'll be a little tab with images there.
How about this? I got it right here. This is low tech, but
okay.
But why don't you tell us what it is? I know it's.
Yeah, I reproduced it in my book. So basically, what happens is that this. There you go. Thank you. Yeah. So there's the isopod in there. Basically, what it does is it swims into a fish's mouth and devours the fish's tongue. It eats it. Yeah, and the top picture there is sort of a cutaway side view, and then it appears to just sort of stick its legs between the gills, the little gill rakers of the fish, and then just hang out. And as far as anybody can tell, it actually becomes the fish's tongue.
The crustacean becomes the tongue of the fish and functions as a tongue, and which, but it must be getting its own nutrients somehow in the process.
Well, yeah. So
it's
I
in
mean,
the mouth.
fish. Yeah, right. So fish don't use their tongues the way we do. The fish use their tongues more to sort of either push food back or to sort of kind of as a surface to mash it up on. So this isopod's got a pretty hard back, and so basically there's all this food coming along, and it's getting broken up and so on, and so the isopod just hangs around and just slurps some of it up. And it's possible that that the fish doesn't really mind. I mean, these fish that get caught with these isopods, they're not scrawny, they're not at death's door, they're okay. So who knows? Maybe it goes from being a parasite to a symbiont, and an incredibly creepy, disturbing symbiont. I mean, if I stuck out my tongue and you saw, a giant silverfish instead, you'd be disturbed. Right. I could understand.
And that fish was doing fine with its own tongue, so it's not unlike some of our symbionts. It was doing okay with its own tongue. It didn't require that to survive. But yeah, fascinating. Yeah, I guess that's so. We actually, if we count just cell count, the human body, what we think of as the human body, has more bacterial cells than what we think of as human cells, but they're so much tinier, maybe 10 times more, but they're quite a bit smaller, huh? They're
right. Yes, they are smaller, but size and everything, and so each of those bacteria may have a couple, at least a few hundred, and maybe several thousand genes that we don't have. So if you want to think of all the genes in your body, so we have about 20,000 protein coding genes, and our microbes might have something like 20 million genes, so about 1,000 times more. So this Human Genome Project, I like to think of it as kind of a nice start. But scientists are just now really starting to sequence all the microbiome genes. And so some of these genes are making proteins and other things that are getting into our guts and into our bloodstream, and then eventually crossing the blood-brain barrier and, doing these disturbing things like influencing our personality. And so there's a lot, actually, there's a lot of molecules that our microbiome sends towards our brain.
Right.
There's a lot.
That recent thing that
not only do they influence.
Yeah, go ahead. No, not only are they recent.
Oh, I was just going to say, not only is this personality stuff interesting, but believe it or not, they seem to be able to send signals to your brain that control your appetite.
Huh. So they're involved in any diet
feed
program.
Us.
Yeah, feed us. Oh, telling you to feed them. They're hungry. You think you're hungry, and it's just your E. coli.
Right. Yeah, and they've done experiments with mice where they actually can raise mice that don't have any germs in them, and then they basically transplant germs into their bodies, and so they will take mice that are raised like on a Western diet, or mice that have gotten really fat, or both, and they find that these mice, once they take in these bacteria, they get really fat, but not only that, but they get really hungry. Their appetite goes way up, and the only difference is that they have bacteria in them.
Wow.
If they have bacteria from other mice, they don't get as hungry. So my bacteria made me fat. I mean, maybe you can say that.
Right. Yeah, I'm big boned, or it just runs in my family, or it's my microflora. The one I saw.
Big microbiome.
I'm sorry, I lost you. Oh,
I'm big microbiome.
Exactly. The one I saw recently was that. So they did the same thing. They had two populations of rats, and one was germ-free in its gut, or I don't know how they accomplished that, but presumably, so one population doesn't have some key microorganisms, and the result was they had a different kind of behavior when they ran these mazes that they relate to anxiety. So that they were less fearful. So, and I guess there's other examples where things, if they either are or aren't infected with something, they then behave differently, like in such a way that they might get themselves eaten. And sometimes that's the parasite's method of getting into the next creature.
Yeah, exactly. So with the bacteria, as far as I understand it, there doesn't seem to be any particular kind of adaptation about changing a host personality. It may just be kind of a side effect. I don't know, though. It'd be interesting to see. But there's this other thing that I think you're talking about, which is it's a protozoan. It's single-celled, but these cells are much bigger than bacteria, and it's called Toxoplasma. And so that's, when women get pregnant, they're not supposed to handle kitty litter. Well, that's because Toxoplasma lives in cats, and they shed it in their droppings, and then Toxoplasma needs to go into another host, a different species, to grow and go into its next stage of its life cycle, and then eventually it has to get back in cats. And so if pregnant women get it, they can't. If the fetus is exposed, they don't have an immune system that can hold it in check, and so they can get brain damage. But if you're a healthy adult, perhaps you, sir, you might have Toxoplasma. You might at some point have been exposed, because it's incredibly common. Like at least a quarter of all people carry it. And so let's say, for the sake of argument, that you are Toxoplasma carrying, okay? That means that you got thousands or tens of thousands of cysts of this parasite in your brain. And they're not dead, they're alive. They're just hanging out and essentially just waiting. And they're releasing molecules out of those cysts. And these are molecules that might be a bit like Prozac, mind-altering drugs. And so with the rats, what seems to happen is that the rats, a rat infected with Toxoplasma is fine. It's healthy. It's normal. The only difference that anyone can really find is that they are not afraid of the smell of cats.
Yeah.
That's it. So, maybe that means that the rats get eaten more often by cats. And then so the Toxoplasma with the genes for that manipulation, they're the ones that won out. And so what's really kind of freaky is to think, well, okay, if they can do that to rats and then they're in us too, what are they doing to us?
Yeah, what motivations that like what? Yeah, I can't trust myself. The main message I'm getting here, though, is that you don't really have to do drugs if you befriend the right microorganisms. Is that what I'm hearing? Is that your next
exactly? Yeah. You have a dealer on the inside, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, someone who's like administering drugs to you every moment of the day. Yeah. Absolutely.
And eventually we need to really befriend some nice, like, photosynthetic microorganisms so that we don't need to eat it all. And you know what? So we're almost out of time, but so let's finish off with something kind of fun. Not that this hasn't been fun, parasites and infections, and no, but a long time ago, you started amassing this collection of science tattoos. And before you know it, it culminates in you having to put out another book, which will appear later this year as Science Inc. Right? You want to flesh that out, for no pun intended there, a little bit. And Alex will prepare a couple. We have a couple of your favorite picks. But how did that come about? Do you have any tattoos yourself?
No, I'm clean.
You're clean. You could be buried in a Jewish cemetery.
So what?
That's one of them.
So I had no idea about that. Oh yeah, so here's Schrodinger's tat.
Dead and alive, right?
Yeah, exactly. Someone who just completely loves quantum physics and just wanted to embrace that on his arm. And so this is the thought experiment where a cat can be alive and dead at the same time, thanks to the multiple states that things can be in quantum physics. So, I mean, basically what happened was that one day I was at a birthday party for my nephew who was turning 3 at the time, I believe, and a friend of ours who was a geneticist at Harvard. He was playing in the pool with his kids, and I noticed that he had a DNA tattoo on his shoulder.
Oh yeah,
and I was like,
"Oh, is that this one?"
That's another guy.
That's another guy with DNA
posing next to the James Watson, who looks a little. I don't know. I'm not sure if that's bemused or befuddled. Like what's happening with this generation of geneticists? Yeah, that's an Irish geneticist who asked Watson if he could pose with him with that. So this other guy, Bob Data, he's at Harvard, and so I saw the DNA, and I was like, well, that's pretty cool. And he's like, what's really cool is that it spells my wife's initials in genetic code.
Really?
And I thought, man, yeah. Talk about geek love.
Yeah.
So that got me thinking, and on my blog I just said, are you scientists out there hiding some tattoos from us? And this is the kind of stuff I would get. This is fulvic acid. This is a molecule that's in soil, that's everywhere. It's just a big old, hydrocarbon. The guy who got this, he's got his PhD in chemistry at Cornell, and he said, I wanted to get this so that I could remember that there are, in fact, things that are more painful than getting a PhD in chemistry in Cornell. So, so it turned out that there are a lot of people with some pretty mind-blowing tattoos. There's Darwin's finches we were talking about.
Oh, I wasn't even seeing that. Yeah. It was like one of those illusions of the old lady or the young woman.
Right.
I was kind of seeing this butterfly thing, like they were like wings or a pattern, but those are Darwin's finches, and those are 4 different beaks.
Right. Now, this is an example of just how much these tattoos mean to people. So this is a woman, she's at Tulane right now. She's a developmental biologist, but she's from Turkey, and she does a lot of work in Turkey in terms of education on evolution. She translates a lot of evolution websites into Turkish and so on. And Turkey is dealing with a lot of creationists as well. And so, this means a whole lot to her. I mean, this is a deeply meaningful thing. And, it's just interesting how people express that with these tattoos, and some are funny and some are quite touching. This is the old image that people had of sperm. of the homunculus. You know, so that little
there's a
person who's
homunculus
hunched
inside
up
there.
with
I
the-
see.
Yeah, right. And so this is a drawing. I believe it's kind of based on a drawing from around 1700. You know, back when people believed in what was called pre-formationism. So they thought the person was all
Right.
tucked up in a sperm and ready to go. I mean, they didn't know that women had eggs.
That's why masturbation is murder.
Yeah. All those little people, you know, you got to be thinking about them. They're all waiting to unfurl.
100
What's funny is
million
that, so why would a guy get a picture like that on his arm? I mean, that goes all the way around his arm. That seems kind of weird. Well, this is a guy named Scott Picnic who studies the biology of sperm. And real sperm, not things with little heads inside, people inside them, but he's really interested in how, for example, sperm compete with each other to get to the egg. There's a little race that goes on.
Right.
And in a lot of animals, the female might mate with 2 or more males, and there's sperm from different males. And whoever gets to the egg first wins. And so there's this huge evolutionary arena inside the female's body, and all the adaptations that sperm can use to win are evolving. So for
there's
example,
like linebackers, there's strategize, and it goes along with the spectrum of like the most promiscuous primates have the most elaborate behavior in their sperms, and the ones that are the most monogamous don't need to.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, just one of the simple things is just sheer numbers. So a chimpanzee has a lot of sperm in its testes, and because basically it's just trying to like create an army and maybe one of that army will get to the egg first instead of the sperm from another male. So again, there's like this whole world in a tattoo, but now that I've got hundreds of them, I sort of felt obligated to write a book. And fortunately, there was a publisher who was really gung ho about it, and I work with these beautiful these book packagers designers who do beautiful work named Scott and Nix, and we've put together this wonderful thing, and I really got obsessed with writing captions for them because, there were all these stories behind them, but there was also all this science. And I mean, I actually had to learn a lot of science just to write these things. So I was getting, science education by tattoo, which is not what I was expecting to be doing at this age.
Well, that's excellent. And so that'll be out later this year, Science Inc.
October.
Tattoos of the Science Obsessed. Is that the subtitle?
Yes, that's right. Science Inc. Yep.
Well, Carl, we're going to have to wrap it up. It's been really fun talking to you. I actually, in preparation, I'd made a blog post at sciencecomedian.com. My most recent, if you go to the blog section, the most recent blog post has some other links to some Carl Zimmer related resources, some recent articles you wrote, something last year on consciousness, and interestingly, a list of science book recommendations that they weren't just your recommendations, they were from your readers as well at your blog.
It was a list of a high school teacher said, hey, I'm going to be assigning some reading in my science class. What are good high school science books? And the sort of collective wisdom of my readers and people on Twitter is better than my own, I would say. And so I just opened it up and got tons of great selections. I feel like there are a few there that I need to either read or reread now.
Yeah, me too.
It's good.
Jerry Coyne, Why Evolution is True. I've been wanting to read that one.
It's a good one.
Good. Yeah. But everything, Robert Sapolsky to a little bit of Richard Feynman and Oliver Sacks and Edward O. Wilson and James Watson and Bill Bryson. Quite a collection of books on a variety of subjects. Richard Preston and Steve Johnson. So thank you very much, Carl, and congrats on all the cool stuff. I saw that the other thing was your textbook on evolution got a very nice little write-up because textbooks aren't always written by science writers. I guess that was the gist in the review. Is that true? Who writes the textbooks? Who's
Scientists.
responsible for the boring tone of typical textbooks?
I'll have to put that on scientists, I'm afraid. There are some scientists who are wonderful writers. You named a whole bunch of them: Robert Sapolsky, Oliver Sacks, and so on. I think there's more. There needs to be more training in writing in the scientific community. That's something that I hope I can help with, because there's a lot of unnecessary torture in reading stuff by scientists.
Yeah.
And I think it's just because they've been trained in how to sequence genomes and to dig up fossils. They haven't been trained in writing.
Yes.
So.
Well, then that keeps you employed and others like you.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, I guess so.
Well, thanks for joining me. Carl Zimmer is
Hey, good.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Carl is at carlzimmer.com. Yeah, I'll let you say thank you in there somewhere eventually, possibly. But carlzimmer.com, at Carl Zimmer on Twitter, at sciencecomedian.com. Check my latest blog post to see some great resources that'll point you towards more Carl. And thank you very much, Carl. And
thank you, sir.
We'll set you free. And next week, we'll have a different show here on Dr. Kiki's Science Hour. Thank you very much for listening and participating if you did. Carl, you certainly did. Thanks a lot.